Good morning to all you wonderful Broncos fans out there. You are watching Legends of Mile High, and this is Thomas Hall, where we talk about history and current events. So, hopefully, we'll have a good show today. We definitely have some interesting Hall of Fame happenings from Peter King. So, we'll be talking about that and a few other things, and anything else you want to throw into the live stream to talk about. If you have some burning questions, burning Hall of Fame questions, or players that you want me to talk about when it comes to the Hall of Fame. So, as we get started here, don't forget to hit the like button, and you can follow me on Twitter at Thomas Hall NFL, and you can ask me anything on Twitter about Hall of Fame if you have any burning questions. So we'll jump into it here and talk about what happened with Peter King. Peter King was having an interview and the subject went to Mike Shanahan. Now, I've been a huge supporter for Mike Shanahan for the Hall of Fame for quite a while, and it seems Peter King is another supporter. In fact, he gave a ringing endorsement for his candidacy for the Hall of Fame during that interview. Now, Peter King's a voter, and he has a bit of sway with the voters when it comes to who should be in the Hall of Fame or not. So that is a pleasant kind of happening, I would say, when it comes to Mike Shanahan's candidacy for the Hall of Fame. Now, I will tell you this. When Bill Cowher got in back in the Centennial Class 2020, it was a bit of a surprise to me and many others. But without Mike Shanahan going in rather soon after that or at the same time, it was a bit of slap in the face to Broncos fans and to Mike Shanahan because when you compare them side to side, there's really no comparison. I mean, Mike Shanahan just has a better record altogether as a head coach. Now, I'm not trying to take away anything from Bill Cowher. He's a great coach. And when you look at both of them from a coaching perspective, I could see, both of them getting in just on that. But the biggest difference between Cowher and Shanahan is Cowher was a good coach. Shanahan revolutionized and changed the NFL, and that is still today that we see see that impact from Mike Shanahan. And I'm talking about the zone blocking scheme, right? That was his, together with Alex Gibbs and a few others, that was kind of his brainchild to bring the zone blocking scheme, the wide, the wide zone type of runs to the forefront in the NFL. And it resulted in two Super Bowls, two back-to-back victories in the late 90s for sure. Resulted in a ton of 1,000-yard rushers, a 2,000-yard rusher, and they're still using that today. Many of the Broncos many of the teams are using the Broncos zone blocking scheme that they started back in the 90s. So that's pretty revolutionary to think back and say that Mike Shanahan was the one that started that all. So, when you look at the Hall of Fame, you have to look at not just what they did on the field, but the impact in the NFL, especially when it comes to coaching or contributors. I mean, when you look back at what Pat Bowlen was able to do, for the TV rights, it wasn't just that he was a great owner and got all these wins. He helped the NFL become better, and that's what Mike Shanahan did. But if you look at his stat, I mean, to back championships, I mean that's rarely done. It's only happened a few times in the NFL, so he was able to accomplish that feat. And he was when he retired, I think he was number 15 in the NFL for wins. I think he might still be. I haven't checked lately, but he was one of the top winningest coaches of all times. So you look at his record and you say, man, he should have been in the Hall of Fame a long time ago. But he's still on the outside looking in, unfortunately. But I think with Peter King saying that, and maybe a few other voters who might be thinking along those lines, he might be able to get in sooner. I know that they got Don Coryell, he's in now, and it was a long wait for him, but he got in because of his innovations, right? And so he wasn't really successful as a head coach as far as getting to the championship game and things like that and wins, but he left his footprint on the NFL. And Shanahan has both, right? He has the innovative and the lasting impact on the NFL, plus the wins, plus the championships. One of the better coaches that ever came down the pike, so to speak. So that is why he should be in the Hall of Fame. and hopefully it will be sooner rather than later. Well, we've got a couple people coming in this morning, so it's great to see some people in here. We'll say hi to them. Keith Brugman is coming in with a comment. Thank you, Keith, for coming in from Facebook. I appreciate you being here this morning. It's bright and early. You got to get the coffee in me to get me going in the morning so I can do the show. But Keith says we need to get ahead of the Hall of Fame inductions. I feel too many are being inducted posthumously, which is just sad. Well, Keith, I absolutely agree with you on that. There are too many people who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame that have been waiting for a very long time. And it's not just Broncos. I think if you really were honest with yourself when you go and look at some of these past players from the 60s and beyond, you could probably find 20 to 30 who have a real legitimate case to be in the Hall of Fame. And they're not even talking about those players anymore. I mean, once in a while, they'll bring up, uh, a senior candidate like that. But for the most part, the voters don't even consider those players. And on top of it, they don't even consider very, very, very rarely consider AFL players. There's a bunch of AFL players that never even get talked about. And just because they played in the American Football League, right? There was this misconceived notion that the AFL was inferior to the NFL. And it might have been early on, but the AFL really kind of changed the game with the passing. And by the time that they merged, the AFL was as good as the NFL, right? Because, I mean, obviously, Joe Namath proved that. He went out and guaranteed victory in a Super Bowl and went out and won it. And that alone really brought legitimacy to the AFL. So when people sit there and talk about how the AFL was inferior, I totally disagree with that. So there's a ton of players, not just Broncos players, who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame that are on the outside looking in. And that has created is this massive backlog. And if you don't get into the Hall of Fame before you go into the senior pool, you are probably not getting in until long after you've passed away. So it's a great point on that, Keith. They're trying. I don't want to knock the Hall of Fame too much. They just opened up 3 consecutive years where 3 seniors get in. So that's a start, and maybe we'll see something else. I think they tried it with the centennial class, but then, of course, the voters kind of took over that centennial class and just did what they felt like doing, and that's when Bill Cowher got in. And I was very disappointed in what the voters did with that centennial class. That should have been a class that you got a bunch of these deserving seniors in from a long time ago, and they kind of rammed in people that they really wanted, and instead of who really needed to get in. So it was unfortunate that they did that. We got Dom coming in also saying, good morning, Thomas Scott in Broncos country. Yeah, Scott's here. Make sure you follow him on Twitter, Scout Kennedy. He's, got a wealth of knowledge, especially on the draft. Scott was out there at the Senior Bowl, so hit him up if you have draft questions, which are coming up. I'm really excited about the draft. And Dom also says they just hate us because we are Denver Broncos. Well, I'll say they used to. I think when you look at what's happened over the last decade, 15 years, a lot of Broncos have gotten into the Hall of Fame. My beef with the Hall of Fame voters goes way back. They have ignored the Broncos of the past for so long. There's a massive backlog of senior pool Broncos. That's the problem. There's Randy Gradishar is snub number one, right? After we got a few of these other players in that have been waiting a long time, Randy Gradishar came to the top. And guess what? He could have got in last year or this year, so to speak, with the voting, get in this year. But voters decided out of the blue to put Joe Klecko in, and that would really rub me the wrong way. Yeah, Joe Klecko, don't get me wrong, a great player, but he did not deserve to be put in before Randy Gradishar and a few others. So that was my beef. That's my beef, as they've generated this massive backlog of Broncos. And I can make an argument for at least 10 senior Bronco candidates out there who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. I can make a pretty solid case for all of them. And whether they get in or not, or whether other people agree with me, that's neither here nor there. But if you can make a case for them, a solid case, then they deserve to have some consideration. And many of them don't even have any consideration. And that's a real problem. But As of late, I think the Broncos have been very well represented in the Hall of Fame, which is great. And I think that has a lot to do. And I know people will disagree with me on this. The social media aspect of getting people out there, getting names out there, people talking with directly to some of the Hall of Famers and getting their minds changed. I think that works more than people want to give it credit for. If it wasn't for the social media, I think a lot of Broncos may not have gotten. I don't think Terrell Davis may have gotten in as early as he did, with a short career, if it hadn't been for campaigning and social media and getting his kind of name recognition. And that, I mean, the Hall of Fame voters are human, right? They respond to everything just like we do. We see stuff on social media and it grabs our attention and we start to think about it and talk about it. They're human. They do the same thing. So a good campaign will help. And that's what I think happened with Clay Matthews. His daughter made a great campaign for him, and he wasn't even really thought about for the Hall of Fame until that happened. And then he almost got it was the first time he made it to the finals, his final year before he went in the senior pool. He didn't quite make it, but from what I heard, he was very, very close to being that final fifth Hall of Famer that got in that year. So don't let people fool you that you can't, be respectful and be smart about it. Talk about their accolades, and I think that will help. Michaela Israel coming in this morning. Good morning. Thank you very much. I hope you have your coffee and you're waking up this morning. Appreciate you being here. I appreciate you supporting Mile High Huddle the way you do. So thank you very much. Michaela's coming back in with a name that's near and dear to my heart, of course. She said, I advocated for Tom Nalen on the show last night. I was on Super Chat Superstar segment. Oh, awesome. I missed it. So I apologize. I didn't get to see you on there. I'll have to check it out going back. But that's wonderful. I'm glad you talk about Tom Nalen because I have talked about Tom Nalen for the Hall of Fame for several years. I think he is deserving of the Hall of Fame. He's overlooked. He's one of the best centers of all time. You can put him in with a lot of the other names that they talk about when it comes to great centers. And there's definitely many reasons. And I could talk the whole show about Tom Nalen. I probably will at some point as we get closer. But just think about what I talked about when it came to the zone blocking scheme, right? Mike Shanahan, that was his kind of brainchild, him and Alex Gibbs. And people talk about, oh, well, it was Alex Gibbs and Mike Shanahan. But the fact of the matter really is the longevity of that being effective, there was one person who made it happen on the field for that whole time, and that was Tom Nalen. So, 97, 98 did iconic line. Don't get me wrong. Zimmerman, Schler, they had some great linemen, but they all left. And Tom Nalen was in the middle of that whole thing for the entire zone blocking scheme under Mike Shanahan, right? He was the mainstay. We had, there's names out there that if I threw out there, I mean, maybe Broncos fans would recognize them, but maybe they wouldn't, who were on that line with him for a long time after everybody else kind of went their separate ways. And also, Alex Gibbs left too. Alex Gibbs went and coached somewhere else while Tom Nalen was still the center, and they were still churning out 1,000-yard rushers. And if you look at, and I'm not taking anything away from Alex Gibbs, don't get me wrong. Alex Gibbs, it was an incredible mind when it came to this, but he left and he didn't have as much success where he went. And I think that's because he didn't have a center like Tom Nalen. So if you look at what happened over those years, Tom Nalen was the one that made this all work on the field. He was a great center. I can go on forever and ever about him, but look it up. I mean, seriously, look up what happened with Alex Gibbs and the other places. He had good success, but not great success. And the Broncos were still doing it with, running backs who you don't even recognize anymore. Maybe Reuben Drones and you got Alandis Gary. You got all these these guys that they were kind of they were fun to watch with the Broncos, but when they went somewhere else, they weren't quite as good. So yeah, thank you for getting out there and talking about Tom Nalen. I'm going to start hitting that pretty hard as soon as the nominations come out, which should be coming out in September, but I'll start a little bit early talking about Tom Nalen. But if you think about Hall of Fame careers, were they remarkable, right? Was a player really good at what he did, and created a remarkable career, like Joe Namath, like I talked about earlier. Joe Namath, is remarkable. He was a good quarterback. Don't get me wrong, but if you look at his career stats and you look at his, what he did with wins, it's not very impressive, even for the time, right? It wasn't really impressive, but his career was remarkable for a couple reasons. One, the guarantee that I talked about, bringing legitimacy to the AFL, and also, the first 4,000-yard passer. There's a few remarkable events, and that's why he's in the Hall of Fame. It's not because of his stats or because of his wins or his number of championships or anything like that, because they weren't there. And that's what Tom Nalen did, right? He was a great center and he was remarkable. He had a remarkable career, a career you could look back and say, if you talk about the NFL and the history of the NFL, you can't, not talk about that zone blocking scheme and what Tom Nalen did as the center, and the iconic lines, 97 and 98, the orange hush. It's an incredible, line. And when you look it up, most historians talk about it being one of the greatest lines of all time. It's usually in the top 10, along with the 90s Cowboys and those type of things. So this is a remarkable career for Tom Nalen. So yeah, he deserves it. It's just one of those things where his name's not out there enough. People don't think about him. Small market, people just kind of forgotten about him. And I'll say another thing too, like he got snubbed in 1998 for the All-Pro, first team All-Pro. He should have won that award. He didn't even get second team All-Pro, but he should have won it. They gave it to DeMarty Dawson, which is a great center, one of the best centers of all time, no doubt. But at that time, if you look at what the Steelers did that season and you compare it to what the Broncos did, there's no comparison. They were terrible. Their offense was terrible. Their running game wasn't that great. They had a Hall of Fame running back in Jerome Bettis who didn't even get 1,200 yards when Terrell Davis was getting 2,000 yards. Had he not been snubbed for that award, I think he would have gotten at least 2 more first team awards, and that would have put him into the Hall of Fame already. So, you think about these voters who don't pay attention. They vote for who they know, and they don't really get into the intricacies of what happened that season. They say, "Oh yeah, DeMarty Dawson, great center. Let's just vote for him." Well, it created a very unfortunate chain reaction that didn't get his center, that's Tom Nalen's as a center, into the Hall of Fame, because it's so hard as for a center to get in. At this point, you have to have about 5 All Pros in order to get into the Hall of Fame. And where you can look at wide receiver, 1 All Pro is good enough. Some of these wide receivers are in because they won All Pro. So there's a lot of things that happened, and unfortunately, so Tom Nalen, hopefully we can get his name out there, get him going, get people talking about him again. And the funny thing is I talk a lot on a show called Not in the Hall of Fame, and the same thing happened. 3 years ago, nobody voted for Tom Nalen in their mock Hall of Fame except me. But he was, after explaining to them how good Tom Nalen was, because they didn't really realize it. After 3 years, he was a finalist, almost made it into the in that mock draft or mock Hall of Fame, which was kind of cool. It was fun. So that's what we got to do. And Michaela, I appreciate you coming in and saying this. I learned a lot about him from this show. I enjoy the history of the show because I'm only 29, so I don't remember or know all of the history. Yeah, absolutely. That's what this show is really trying to be about, is, blending that history with some current events so it kind of stays relevant. But yeah, I'm going to, I definitely enjoy talking about history, and I appreciate you saying that. I'm glad that you're learning from the show, and I'm bringing back the Mile High Legend. I know that a couple of people have said, bring it back. So I'm going to bring it back. So next week, I'm going to bring back the Mile High Legend. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that you said that. So thank you very much. This was show's all about. So if you have any other ideas out there of who you think may be in the Hall of Fame, I'll let you know if that player should be. I'm pretty honest when it comes to the Hall of Fame. I don't think every Bronco should be in there, but there are some that are deserving. And, one that I talk about that nobody else talks about that I think doesn't get any recognition is Lionel Taylor, one of the early Broncos, one of the, first Broncos that kind of was a star. He doesn't get talked about enough for what he did. Obviously the Broncos were terrible back then, but he was the first person to get 100 receptions in a season. Right. And he also had 5 great seasons that were good enough that they were still in the top 15, about in the 80s and into the 90s. So some of those seasons were still some of the top reception seasons of all time for a very, very long time. So he was kind of ahead of his time. So there's a few out there that people don't talk about. So I got a Tampa Bay Bucks question here talking about how did Warren Sapp get in the Hall of Fame? That's that's interesting. Deuce from New Orleans is saying that. Yeah, I mean, he got in the Hall of Fame because of that legendary defense. I mean, he was a star on that legendary Bucks defense that got them a Super Bowl victory. So he's in. He was a very popular player at the time. People knew his name, and he's kind of a pain in my mind. I didn't really care for him, but his talent on the field was unquestionable, and that they're starting to put a lot of those players in to the Hall of Fame from that legendary defense. So you're going to see four players from that defense in the Hall of Fame now. So that's it's definitely interesting question. But yeah, I didn't really care for Warren Sapp when he played. I know people liked him, but I thought he was kind of I don't know. He just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. So he's definitely worthy of it. Whether I liked his character or not is neither here nor there. Alden Fish coming in. Alden, good to see you in here this morning. He says, I also have learned a lot about the Broncos history from you, Thomas. Enjoy the show every Friday. Well, that's awesome. I'm glad that I can impart some historical wisdom. I've been watching the Broncos since the early 80s, and I've been researching them, trying to go back to their history. And that's kind of, from the start from 1960 on to try and understand what it was like to, to watch the Broncos back then. And unfortunately they had a rough go for a long, long time. So, it was tough to watch the Broncos back then. They were pretty bad, but they had some great players. There's some great players that came through, and I think many of them are just forgotten about now. I mean, most people don't remember Lyle Taylor or Goose Gonsolin, and Rich Tombstone Jackson his name seems to come up because he's got a great nickname, but people don't realize for 3 seasons he was, and going on his 4th season, he was probably one of the greatest defenders during that period. And then injury happened and he was gone. So there are some great names back then that need to stay alive. All right. So we don't really have too many more comments left. I know that a lot of people like to hear the current events, and don't jump in here unless we're talking about Denver Broncos today. But Mike Shanahan, I'm going to just wrap this up and say, Mike Shanahan, I'm going to bet with the buzz that keeps happening about Mike Shanahan, people talking about him and what he did, and people starting to recognize that he went to Washington, didn't have a great success. They're kind of starting to push that aside and start to look at what he did with the Broncos. I think over the next 3 to 4 years, you're probably going to see him get into the Hall of Fame, which is pretty impressive. And after that, I think then the next step would be, Dan Reeves' candidacy. I don't know if he's ever going to get in. I think he deserves it. So those are 2 coaches that will, I know one of them will get into the Hall of Fame. I don't know if I'm being a little bit too optimistic about Mike Shanahan in the next 3 to 4 years, but I think it's very, very plausible. I think just a little bit more buzz about him, people are going to look at what he did, and the voters are going to come around. So we'll see what happens. And that I'll just keep my fingers crossed for that. But the one player that we really need to make a push for before he goes to the Senior Bowl, he's got a few years left, obviously, and that's Tom Nalen. Let's get him into the Hall of Fame before he has to get into the Senior Pool, and then it's going to be 20, 30 years before they're even talking about him. So those 2, Mike Shanahan and Tom Nalen, after Randy Gradishar, of course, which I think he's getting in this year. I think he got snubbed again last year, and I think people have had enough of it, and I think he'll be in. So we're going to see hopefully over the next 5 years, maybe 3 Broncos in the Hall of Fame. We'll see. But that'll be a great time. And if Tom Nalen does get in, I'm definitely going to Canton for his enshrinement. So anyway, so don't forget, We've got the Mile High Legend coming back next week, so stay tuned for that. I will let you know what that's going to be. It takes a lot of research to do that, so doing 3 shows is makes it a little tougher for me to do a lot of research. But since people like it, I'm going to bring it back. And just going to grab Keith Brugman from Facebook one more time, coming in saying Shanahan's coaching tree needs to push him in the media. Then he's in 2 to 3 years. Yeah, that's undeniable. The coaching tree that he has and the success that's come down. He's from the Jim Lee Howell coaching tree, really. I know people talk about him being from the Bill Walsh coaching tree, but when I look at the coaching trees, I talk about the leadership that's kind of passed down. So it was Jim Lee Howell, to Tom Landry, to Dan Reeves, to Mike Shanahan. Now we got Kyle Shanahan. We got his tree. It's amazing the leadership and the ability to coach passed down. And he did learn from Bill Walsh, obviously. Well, that's that tree he was coaching with George Seifert, but yeah, he learned from that tree as well. But the leadership qualities and passing that on, I kind of compare that, with Bill Parcells versus some of these others. Bill Parcells has an incredible track record right after him with Bill Belichick, but the second, the next step down is, they kind of struggled. So how that leadership was passed down from some trees and not others, it's quite amazing. But you're right. Shanahan has left an imprint on the NFL today, not just with his own blocking scheme, but with the coaches. And David Youngkin's coming in real quick saying, morning Broncos country in Thomas. So good morning to you, David. I am going to wrap up the show. It is almost at the half hour, and that's what this show is really designed for. So thank you all for whoever came in and made comments and joined this morning. I really appreciate it. We're going to talk more and more about Mike Shanahan and Tom Nalen. So let's get them in the Hall of Fame. And everybody have a great Friday and have a great weekend. And we will see you next week. So thank you very much.